Welcome to Sleep Stories and Rain, where the veil between worlds grows thin and the spirits speak through the Ouija board. Tonight, we summon chilling tales of whispered messages, moving planchettes, and the terrifying unknown that answers when we ask. Only 50% of you are subscribed. If you love unsettling encounters and supernatural suspense, please support us by subscribing and liking this video. Share your own Ouija experiences in the comments. Did you contact a lost loved one or something far darker? Your stories fuel our nightmares. Gather round, light a candle, and hold tight as we begin our first eerie journey into the world of Ouija board horrors. The Ouija board still sits in my basement, burned and cracked, but I can't bring myself to throw it away. Every night I hear the faint scraping sound of the planchette moving across its surface, spelling out messages I refuse to read. I suppose I should start from the beginning, though I wish I could forget every detail of what happened 3 months ago. My friends thought it would be fun to mess around with the old board we found in Sarah's grandmother's attic. The thing looked ancient, with ornate letters carved deep into dark wood that felt cold even in the summer heat. Sarah insisted her grandmother had been into spiritual stuff before she died, but we just laughed it off. We were 18 and bored, looking for any excuse to feel a thrill. We set it up in my basement around midnight, lighting candles because Sarah said it would enhance the connection. Marcus kept making jokes about talking to dead celebrities while Jenny rolled her eyes. I remember thinking how stupid we all looked, sitting cross-legged around this piece of wood, with our fingers barely touching the heart-shaped planchette. "Is anyone there?" Sarah asked in her most dramatic voice. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then the planchette began to move. At first, we accused each other of pushing it. The board spelled out, "Yes!" so clearly that we all pulled our hands back and stared at each other. Jenny insisted Marcus was moving it, but his face had gone pale. When we placed our fingers back on the planchette, it immediately began moving again. The board spelled out, "Help me," and the temperature in the room dropped so fast I could see my breath. The candles flickered, but didn't go out. Marcus wanted to stop, but Sarah was fascinated. She kept asking questions. "Who are you? How did you die? What do you want?" The answers came quickly. The board spelled out, "Trapped between walls." Then "Sarah knows." We all looked at Sarah, but she shook her head frantically, claiming she had no idea what it meant. The planchette moved again. "Check the house." That's when things got really wrong. The planchette started moving on its own without any of us touching it. It scraped across the board violently, spelling out message after message. "She lied. Look in the walls. Grandmother knew. Sarah knows where I am." Sarah broke down crying, admitting something she'd hidden from us for years. Her grandmother hadn't died peacefully in her sleep like everyone thought. She'd been acting strange in her final months, claiming someone was living in the walls of her house. The family thought it was dementia, but Sarah had heard scratching sounds and whispers coming from inside the walls during her visits. The board spelled out, "Basement wall behind furnace," and suddenly we knew we had to go to Sarah's grandmother's house. The place had been sitting empty since she died, waiting for the family to decide what to do with it. We drove there at 2 a.m, our hearts pounding. Sarah still had a key. The house smelled like dust and old flowers, and every shadow seemed to move in our flashlight beams. In the basement, behind the old furnace, we found a section of wall that sounded hollow when Marcus tapped it. Using a crowbar from the garage, we broke through the drywall. The smell hit us first, something sweet and rotten that made Jenny throw up. Inside the wall was a small space, maybe 3 feet wide, and curled up at the bottom was a skeleton wearing the remains of a blue dress. We called the police, of course. They identified the remains as Linda Morrison, a local woman who'd gone missing 15 years earlier. Apparently, she'd been having an affair with Sarah's grandfather. When Sarah's grandmother found out, she'd lured Linda to the house and trapped her in that wall space, then built over it. The official investigation concluded that Linda had scratched at the walls until her fingers were bone, trying to get out. She died slowly, over several days, calling for help that never came. But here's the part that still keeps me awake at night. When the police were removing Linda's remains, Sarah whispered to me that her grandmother had confessed everything to her right before she died. Sarah had known about Linda's body for 2 years, but was too scared to tell anyone. The Ouija board had somehow known that Sarah was the key to finding Linda. It had used our innocent game to finally give Linda Morrison the voice she'd been denied for 15 years. Now, 3 months later, I still hear that scraping sound every night. Sometimes I creep down to the basement and find new messages burned into the board. Thank you. But last week, the message changed. Now it just says, there are others. I don't know if Linda is still trying to communicate or if we've opened some kind of door that other spirits can use. All I know is that the board won't let me rest. Every night it calls to me, promising to reveal more secrets, more hidden bodies, more terrible truths that people have buried. Sometimes I wonder if Linda Morrison was just the beginning.
I found the Ouija board in my grandmother's attic 3 days after her funeral, hidden beneath a pile of moth-eaten quilts that smelled like lavender and secrets. The moment my fingers touched the smooth wooden surface, I felt something cold crawl up my spine, like ice water trickling through my veins. I should have left it there, buried under those quilts where it belonged, but grief makes you do stupid things. Grandma Rose had always been different. She knew things before they happened, spoke to empty rooms like someone was listening, and kept that attic locked tighter than a bank vault. Now I understood why. The board was beautiful in a terrible way, carved from dark wood with silver letters that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. The planchette sat in the center like a sleeping spider, waiting. That first night, I brought it down to my apartment. I told myself I just wanted to talk to Grandma one more time, to say the goodbye I never got to say. The candles flickered as I placed my fingertips on the planchette, and I whispered her name into the darkness. The response was immediate. The planchette jerked beneath my fingers with such force that I nearly pulled away. It began to move in slow, deliberate circles before sliding to spell out, "Rose is not here." My blood turned to ice. If it wasn't Grandma, then what was I talking to? I tried to lift my hands, but they wouldn't budge. My fingers felt glued to the planchette as it continued moving. The board spelled out, "She kept me trapped for 60 years. The temperature in my apartment plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs as frost began forming on the windows. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, though my throat felt like sandpaper. The planchette moved faster now, almost violently. "Margaret Thorne. She murdered me." My heart hammered against my ribs. Grandma Rose, a murderer? It was impossible. She made cookies and knitted scarves and sang lullabies. But as the entity calling itself Margaret continued to communicate through the board, the story that emerged made my stomach churn. Margaret had been Grandma's sister-in-law, married to my grandfather's brother. The board spelled out how Rose had pushed her down the basement stairs during a family gathering in 1963, then told everyone it was an accident. Margaret's spirit had been bound to this very Ouija board ever since, trapped by Rose's knowledge of dark rituals she'd learned from their grandmother. The candles in my apartment began to flicker wildly. Objects started moving on their own, books sliding off shelves, pictures rotating on walls, my coffee mug shattering against the floor. Margaret's rage was feeding off my fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. "I can taste freedom," the board spelled out. "Rose dead, binding broken, soon I will be whole." That's when I saw her. A figure began materializing in the corner of my living room, translucent at first but becoming more solid by the second. Margaret Thorne was tall and gaunt, with stringy gray hair hanging over a face twisted by decades of supernatural fury. Her dress was the same one she'd died in, torn and stained with blood that never dried. She pointed one skeletal finger at me and spoke in a voice like grinding glass. "You freed me, child. You broke the final seal. Now I can finish what your grandmother started." I finally understood why Grandma had kept the board locked away. It wasn't just to contain Margaret, it was to protect our family from her vengeance. Margaret blamed all of us for her death and decades of imprisonment. The apartment shook as Margaret's form solidified completely. She was no longer bound to the board. My hands finally came free from the planchette, but it was too late. She lunged forward with inhuman speed, her fingers like ice around my throat. I managed to grab the Ouija board and smash it against the wall with every ounce of strength I had. The wooden surface cracked down the middle, and Margaret let out a shriek that shattered every window in my apartment. But instead of banishing her, breaking the board seemed to make her stronger. "Foolish girl," she hissed. "The board was my prison, not my power source." As Margaret's hands tightened around my throat and darkness began creeping in from the edges of my vision, I realized the horrible truth. Grandma hadn't trapped Margaret to punish her. She'd trapped her to protect the world from something far worse than a vengeful spirit. She'd trapped a demon that had been wearing Margaret's face for 60 years, growing stronger in the darkness, waiting for someone foolish enough to set it free. And that someone was me.
I should have burned that board the moment I found it in my grandmother's attic, but curiosity killed more than just the cat that night. The antique Ouija board sat beneath a dusty white sheet, its aged wood practically humming with an energy that made my skin crawl. When I lifted it into the dim light filtering through the attic window, I noticed dark stains around the edges that looked suspiciously like dried blood. My grandmother had passed away 3 months earlier, leaving me her Victorian house and all its secrets. I'd been avoiding the attic until that rainy October evening when I finally worked up the courage to explore. The board seemed to call to me, its ornate letters and numbers carved deep into the wood with craftsmanship I'd never seen before. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I carried it downstairs to the living room. That first night, I sat alone on the hardwood floor with the board between my crossed legs. The planchette felt ice cold under my fingertips as I placed them lightly on its surface. "Is anyone there?" I whispered into the darkness, feeling foolish but unable to stop myself. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move. The board spelled out "Hello, David," and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. I jerked my hands away, but the planchette kept sliding across the board on its own. It moved to spell "Don't stop now," as I watched in frozen terror. My rational mind insisted I was moving it unconsciously, but deep down I knew something else was controlling that piece of wood. Over the next week, I became obsessed with the board. Every night after work, I'd rush home and set it up in the living room. The entity, who claimed its name was Marcus, seemed friendly at first. It told me about my grandmother's life, revealing family secrets I'd never heard before. When I called my aunt to verify some of the information, she went silent on the other end of the phone. "Where did you hear about Uncle Robert?" she finally asked, her voice shaking. "Nobody talks about what happened to him in 1952. But Marcus wasn't content to just chat about family history. As the days passed, its messages became more demanding. The board would spell out, "Play with me," even when I wasn't touching the planchette. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning to find the board had moved from the closet where I'd hidden it back to the living room floor, the planchette spinning slowly in circles. The turning point came on a Friday night when I brought my girlfriend Sarah over for dinner. I'd never told her about the board, but halfway through our meal, she suddenly went rigid in her chair. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, and when she spoke, it wasn't her voice anymore. "David knows my secret," she said in a deep, masculine tone that made my stomach lurch. "David plays with me every night." Sarah collapsed forward onto her plate, unconscious. When she came to minutes later, she had no memory of what had happened, but there were deep scratches on her arms that spelled out "mine" in jagged letters. I drove her to the hospital, making up some story about her falling in the garden. That night, I tried to burn the board in the fireplace, but the flames wouldn't touch it. I tried breaking it with a hammer, but the wood was harder than steel. Every method of destruction I attempted failed, and each failure seemed to amuse Marcus more. The board would spell out, "Can't get rid of me," followed by what I can only describe as laughter expressed through the violent shaking of the planchette. The final night, I woke up to find myself standing in the living room in my underwear, my hands on the planchette. I had no memory of getting out of bed or setting up the board. As I watched in horror, my own hands moved against my will to spell out a message I'll never forget. Your body is mine now. I felt Marcus sliding into my mind like ice water filling a bucket, pushing my consciousness into a dark corner while he took control. For hours, I was a prisoner in my own body, watching helplessly as he used my hands to write page after page of symbols I didn't recognize in my own handwriting. When the sun finally rose and his grip loosened enough for me to regain control, I knew I had to act fast. I couldn't destroy the board, but I could hide it where no one would ever find it. I drove to the old quarry outside town and threw it into the deepest part of the water, watching it sink into the murky depths. That was 6 months ago, and I thought I was free. But last week, I saw on the news that they're draining the quarry for a construction project. They found the board yesterday, and according to the reporter, the construction foreman said it looked like it hadn't been underwater at all, completely dry and perfectly preserved. They're planning to donate it to the local antique shop downtown. I've been driving past that shop every day, watching and waiting, knowing that someone else will soon make the same mistake I did. The worst part is that sometimes, late at night, I can still feel Marcus scratching at the inside of my skull, whispering that our game isn't over yet. I swore I'd never touch another Ouija board after what happened in my basement 3 months ago. But here I am, telling you this story because the nightmares won't stop, and maybe getting it out will help me sleep again. My name is Marcus, and I used to think the dead stayed dead until I learned some doors should never be opened. It started as a joke during a power outage on Halloween night. My girlfriend Zara had brought over this antique Ouija board she'd found at an estate sale, its wooden surface worn smooth and painted with ornate letters that seemed to shimmer in our candlelight. My roommate Devin thought it was stupid, but when the storm knocked out our electricity and we had nothing else to do, we all gathered around it on my basement floor. The first few minutes were harmless enough. We asked silly questions about our futures, and the planchette moved sluggishly across the board, spelling out vague answers that could have been any of us unconsciously pushing it. Zara asked if there were any spirits present, and the board spelled out yes so quickly that we all pulled our hands back in surprise. None of us had moved it that fast. "Who are you?" Devin asked, his voice shaking slightly. The planchette began moving with purpose, spelling out Thomas Wright buried alive 1952. The room grew noticeably colder, and the candles flickered despite the lack of any breeze in my sealed basement. Zara's dark eyes reflected the wavering light as she whispered that we should ask more questions. I wish we'd stopped there. I wish we'd packed up the board and spent the night playing cards instead. But we were young and stupid, and the thrill of contact with something beyond our world was intoxicating. "How did you die, Thomas?" I asked, my hands trembling as I placed them back on the planchette. The response came with violent force, the planchette nearly flying across the board as it spelled out, "Mistaken for dead, woke up in coffin, scratched until fingers bled, screamed until throat tore no one heard." The temperature plummeted so suddenly that our breath began to fog, and somewhere in the walls around us came the sound of frantic scratching. Devin tried to pull his hands away, but the planchette held them fast, his fingers turning white with the effort to escape. The scratching grew louder, moving through the walls in a pattern that circled our basement like something trapped was trying to claw its way out. Zara was crying now, begging whatever presence was with us to let us go, but the board wasn't finished. "Let me out," appeared on the board without any of us asking a question. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that made my blood freeze, the creaking of old wood under pressure, like a coffin lid being pushed from the inside. The candles began to flicker more violently, and in their dancing light, I saw something that still visits my dreams. The basement walls started to bulge inward, the drywall cracking as if something enormous was pressing against them from the other side. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and through the largest crack, a pale hand emerged, fingernails torn and bloody, scratching desperately at the air. Then another hand, and another, until a dozen ghostly appendages were clawing their way into our reality. The planchette spelled out, "Bury you all, scratched together forever," as the temperature dropped so low that frost began forming on the metal pipes above our heads. The hands reached toward us with desperate hunger, and I could hear voices, now dozens of them, whispering about darkness and suffocation and the terrible sound of dirt hitting wood. Zara grabbed the board and threw it against the far wall, shattering it into pieces. The moment it broke, the hands vanished, the scratching stopped, and our basement returned to normal temperature. But the damage was done. Thomas Wright had found a way through, and he wasn't alone. Now I hear scratching in my walls every night. Sometimes I wake to find dirt on my sheets and under my fingernails, though I haven't been outside. Zara moved back to her parents' house after she started sleepwalking to graveyards. Devin won't return my calls, and his social media posts have become increasingly strange, filled with photos of old cemeteries and antique coffins. The worst part is that I've started having dreams where I'm underground, trapped in a wooden box that's too small, scratching at the lid until my fingers bleed. In these dreams, I can hear Thomas Wright's voice promising that soon I'll join him, that soon we'll all be together in the dark where no one can hear us scream. Sometimes I wonder if I'm already dead, if that night in the basement was actually the moment I suffocated, and everything since has been the confused dream of a dying brain. But then I remember the scratching sounds getting louder each night, and I know that whatever we awakened is still out there, still digging its way toward the surface, still hungry for company in its eternal grave. I still get nightmares about that old Ouija board, and it's been 3 years since I threw it in the lake behind our house. My hands shake just thinking about those final moments when I realized we hadn't been talking to the dead at all. We'd been giving directions to something that was very much alive and had been waiting patiently in the walls of my childhood home for someone stupid enough to open the door. It started innocently enough during winter break my senior year. My best friend Marcus and I were bored out of our minds, stuck in my parents' old farmhouse while they visited my grandmother in Florida. The house felt different when it was just the two of us, bigger somehow, with more shadows in the corners and strange sounds that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. That's when Marcus remembered the dusty board game collection in the basement and suggested we try the Ouija board he'd spotted weeks earlier. The basement smelled like mildew and old wood when we went down to find it. The board was tucked behind a stack of moldy boxes, covered in a thin layer of dust that made us both sneeze. It looked ancient. The wooden surface was dark and weathered, with ornate letters carved deep into the grain. The planchette was made of the same dark wood, smooth from years of use. Marcus joked that it probably belonged to my great-aunt Clara, who everyone said was a little too interested in the supernatural before she died in that house 20 years ago. We set it up on the kitchen table that first night, lighting candles because Marcus insisted it would work better in dim lighting. At first, nothing happened. We asked stupid questions like whether we'd pass our midterms and if Sarah Chen from chemistry class liked me. The planchette barely moved, and when it did, we accused each other of pushing it. But then Marcus asked if anyone was there with us, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The board spelled out, "Clara waiting long time." My heart hammered against my ribs, but Marcus was excited. He peppered the board with questions about my great-aunt, and the responses came quickly now. The planchette glided smoothly under our fingers, spelling out answers that seemed to know intimate details about my family. Clara told us she'd been watching over the house, that she was lonely, that she missed talking to the living. It felt incredible, like we'd discovered something magical. For the next 3 nights, we spent hours at that kitchen table. Clara's responses became more elaborate, more personal. She knew things about my childhood that I'd never told anyone, remembered conversations I'd forgotten. She seemed so grateful for our company, so eager to share stories about the old days. But on the 4th night, something changed. When Marcus asked Clara how she died, the planchette hesitated for the first time. The board spelled out Clara not here anymore. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at those words. "Then who are we talking to?" I whispered. The response came immediately, the planchette moving with violent jerks that made our fingers slip. "Been watching you sleep." Marcus pulled his hands away like the planchette had burned him, but it kept moving on its own, sliding across the board with increasing speed. The candles flickered as if a cold wind had blown through the sealed kitchen. The board continued its message. "In the walls, in the dark, feeding on your fear." That's when I heard it, a wet, sliding sound coming from inside the wall behind me, like something large and soft dragging itself through the narrow spaces between the studs. The sound moved slowly upward toward the ceiling, then across to the next wall. Marcus grabbed my arm so hard I knew I'd have bruises, his eyes wide with terror as he pointed at the wall where the paint was beginning to bubble and peel in a long, writhing line that followed the sound. The planchette slammed into the word "goodbye" and flew off the table, clattering across the floor. But the scratching in the walls grew louder, more aggressive, as if whatever was in there was trying to claw its way out. Pieces of drywall began raining down from the ceiling, and I could see something dark and wet seeping through the cracks. We ran. We grabbed the board, ran straight to the lake, and threw it as far as we could into the dark water. The scratching stopped the moment it sank, and the house fell silent, except for our ragged breathing. I never told my parents about the damage we found the next morning. Long gouges in every wall, like massive claws had raked through the drywall from the inside. We told them it was water damage and helped them renovate the entire first floor that spring. But sometimes, late at night in my college dorm, I still hear that wet sliding sound in the walls, and I wonder if throwing the board away was enough, or if some doors, once opened, can never really be closed again. The darkness was a friend. It had been for months, a thick blanket that helped me ignore the blinking cursor on my screen, mocking my empty pages. Writer's block wasn't just a phrase, it was a hungry beast, gnawing at my insides. I was Finn, a man who once crafted worlds with words, now watching them crumble. Desperation gnawed at me, a cold fear that the stories had simply left. One rainy afternoon, digging through a box of old curiosities from my grandmother's attic, I found it, an antique Ouija board. It was made of dark, polished wood, with intricate carvings and letters worn smooth by countless fingers. I chuckled, remembering childhood sleepovers, cheap thrills in the dark. But then an idea sparked, a flicker in the vast emptiness of my mind. What if it could inspire a ghost story? Not a real spirit, of course, just a muse. A silly, harmless way to kickstart the words. I set the board on my desk, the old wood soft under my fingertips. The room was dark, save for the weak glow from my desk lamp. The air grew still, the usual sounds of my old house fading into a hush. I placed my finger on the planchette, half expecting nothing. My heart gave a strange thump as the planchette moved. Slowly, deliberately, it dragged across the board. It spelled out, "Welcome." My breath caught. I blinked, then laughed, a nervous, shaky sound. Must be my imagination, or just my own unconscious hand. I asked, "Who are you?" The planchette started to move again, faster this time, pulling my hand with it. It spelled out, "Your muse." A shiver ran down my spine, but a thrill too. This was good. This was inspiration. I started asking questions, prompting it for details for my story. It gave me names, places, fragments of a dark history. The words flowed from my fingers onto the keyboard faster than they had in years. The story was becoming something terrifying, something real. But the board's messages grew more unsettling. It started to spell out things that weren't for my story, things about me. Lonely, it spelled one night. Afraid. It knew things no one should. My heart pounded, but I couldn't stop. It was feeding me words, and I was starving for them. Then came the dictations. The planchette would move on its own, dragging my finger along, spelling out entire sentences. They weren't just ideas anymore, they were commands. "Write about the room behind the wall," it demanded. I didn't have a room behind the wall in my story. I didn't in my house either. But the entity insisted. It has been waiting. My sanity frayed at the edges. I started seeing things, shadows at the corner of my vision, the familiar creaks of the old house sounding like whispers. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the carved letters of the board. One night, the planchette slammed into the word through. My hand burned. It spelled out, "She stepped through." My mind screamed, but I couldn't pull my hand away. The air in the room dropped several degrees, and a scent like old, damp earth filled my nose. A low, raspy whisper seemed to come from all around me, not just the board. I felt a cold touch on my shoulder, distinct and chilling. I wasn't just writing a story anymore, I was living it. The muse wasn't just inspiring me, it was creating its reality right here. I had to finish the book, it said, or I would become part of its narrative. A character, trapped in the chilling tale I was forced to write. It was a race against time, me versus whatever ancient horrors I had unwittingly unleashed. The stories flowed, but they were no longer mine. They belonged to the entity, and I was just its scribe. I was losing myself, my days and nights blurring into a haze of fear and furious typing. My home, once a safe haven, was now a prison haunted by my own creation. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that if I didn't finish the story on its terms, I wouldn't just be out of words. I'd be out of life. I should have thrown that board away the moment I found it in my grandmother's attic, but something about its aged wood and faded letters drew me in like a moth to flame. The Ouija board had belonged to my great-aunt Sarah, who died under mysterious circumstances in 1987. And now here I was, 20 years old and desperate enough to try talking to the dead. My girlfriend Maya had just broken up with me. My dad was dying of cancer, and I felt like my whole world was crumbling around me. I figured, what harm could it do to ask for some guidance from beyond? The first time I used it alone in my dorm room, nothing happened. My fingers barely touched the planchette as I asked simple questions, but it just sat there like a piece of junk. I was about to give up when my roommate Jake walked in, laughing at me for being so desperate. But when I convinced him to try it with me, everything changed. The moment both our hands touched that heart-shaped pointer, it began to move with a life of its own. The board spelled out, "Hello, Thomas," before either of us had even asked a question. My blood ran cold because I had never told Jake that Thomas was my middle name. Jake's face went white as the planchette continued moving, spelling out, "I have been waiting." When we asked who was speaking to us, the response chilled us to the bone. Sarah, my great-aunt's name, the same woman whose board we were using. Over the next few weeks, Jake and I became obsessed with our nightly sessions. Sarah seemed friendly at first, giving us advice about school and relationships. She told us things about my family that I had never heard before, details that I later confirmed with my grandmother. But slowly, her messages became darker and more demanding. She wanted us to do things for her, small things at first, like lighting candles or leaving food out overnight. When we hesitated, the board would spell out angry threats about what would happen if we disobeyed. Then Sarah started asking us to hurt people. She gave us detailed instructions about classmates she wanted us to punish for imagined slights. The board spelled out, "Break his arm," when I mentioned a guy who had been rude to me in class. When we refused, the temperature in our room dropped so fast we could see our breath, and books started flying off our shelves. Jake wanted to quit, but every time we tried to put the board away, terrible things would happen. His laptop crashed and lost all his files. My car windows shattered overnight. We found dead birds arranged in perfect circles around our dorm building. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday night in November. We had been trying to ignore the board for 3 days, but the supernatural attacks were getting worse. Our room was freezing cold despite the heater running full blast, and we could hear scratching sounds inside the walls that kept us awake all night. When we finally gave in and used the board again, Sarah's message was different than usual. Instead of her typical demands, she spelled out something that made my heart stop. "I am not Sarah." When we frantically asked who had been talking to us all these weeks, the planchette moved with violent, jerky motions to spell out the one who killed her. The entity explained with sick pleasure how it had been trapped in the board since murdering my great-aunt in 1987, feeding off the energy of anyone foolish enough to use it. It had been growing stronger with each session. using our life force to build power in the physical world. The dead birds, the broken windows, the supernatural attacks, those were just the beginning of what it could do now that it had enough strength. Jake tried to rip his hands away from the planchette, but they seemed glued to the surface. The board spelled out its final message as we watched in horror. Tonight, you join Sarah. The lights in our room began flickering wildly, and a shadow darker than anything I had ever seen started rising from the board itself. I could hear my great-aunt's voice screaming my name from somewhere far away, warning me to run before it was too late. I managed to break free and grabbed a baseball bat, smashing that cursed board into splinters while Jake collapsed unconscious on the floor. The moment the wood shattered, the shadow let out an inhuman shriek and vanished, taking with it the oppressive cold that had been suffocating us. Jake woke up with no memory of the past month, and I never told him what really happened. I burned every piece of that board and scattered the ashes in running water, just like my grandmother taught me. That was 5 years ago, and I still wake up some nights hearing scratching sounds in my walls. I have never touched another Ouija board since, and I never will. Some doors should never be opened, because you never know what might be waiting on the other side, hungry for a way into our world.
I still can't touch a Ouija board without my hands shaking. People think I'm being dramatic, but they weren't there that night when Sarah's basement became something else entirely. They didn't see what crawled out of the alphabet. It started as a stupid sleepover game. Sarah had found her grandmother's old board tucked away in a dusty corner of the basement, wrapped in black velvet like some precious relic. The thing looked ancient, with letters carved deep into dark wood that seemed to absorb the light from our phones. Maya thought it was cool. I thought it looked hungry. "Come on, don't be such a baby," Sarah laughed, setting up candles around us in a circle. "It's just a game." But when we placed our fingers on the planchette, the temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. The basement felt wrong, like we were being watched by something that had been waiting a very long time for visitors. The planchette started moving immediately. Not the gentle gliding you see in movies, but sharp, violent jerks that made our hands cramp. The board spelled out "Welcome home" over and over, faster each time, until our fingers were burning from trying to keep up. "Who are you?" Maya whispered, and I wished she hadn't asked. The planchette shot to the letters so hard it nearly flew off the board. "The girl in the walls." Sarah went pale. My grandmother told me stories about a girl who used to live here. She disappeared in the 1960s. They never found her body. That's when the scratching started. Soft at first, like mice in the walls, then louder, deeper, like fingernails dragging across wood from the inside. The sound seemed to follow the board's messages, growing more frantic with each word it spelled. "Where is my mother?" appeared on the board, and the scratching became pounding. Dust rained from the ceiling as something hammered against the walls from within. We should have stopped. We should have run. Instead, Maya kept asking questions, her voice shaking but determined. "What happened to you?" The planchette moved so violently it cut Sarah's finger. Blood dripped onto the board, and I swear the wood absorbed it like a sponge. The basement lights flickered as the board spelled out, "He put me here, in the cement, still alive." That's when we heard the crying. A child's voice, muffled and distant, coming from behind the basement walls. Sarah's face went ghost white. "The foundation," she whispered. "Grandma said they poured new concrete in the basement right after the girl disappeared." The crying grew louder, more desperate, and the board wouldn't stop moving. 30 years in the dark. So hungry. So angry. The candles started going out one by one, but the planchette kept moving in the darkness, T-slit, spelling out words we could feel through our fingertips. "Let me out. Let me out. Let me out." Then Maya screamed. Something was wrong with the wall behind her. The concrete was bulging outward, cracking in spiderweb patterns. Water seeped through the cracks, dark and thick and smelling like death. The crying was right there now, right behind the wall, and I realized it wasn't water coming through those cracks. The planchette spelled out one final message: "She's coming through." The wall exploded. I don't remember much after that. just running, screaming, the feeling of something cold and wet grabbing at my ankles as we raced up the basement stairs. Sarah slammed the door, and we never went back down. The next day, Sarah's parents found a hole in the basement wall. Behind it was a small space, just big enough for a child. They found clothes, toys, and bones that the police later identified as belonging to Jennifer Mills, the girl who vanished in 1967. But here's what keeps me awake at night. They never found all the bones. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still feel that board spelling out messages under my fingertips. Still hear that desperate, angry voice asking the same question over and over. Why didn't you let me finish? Because whatever came through that wall that night, I don't think it was Jennifer Mills. I think it was something else entirely, something that had been waiting in that dark space for decades, feeding on her bones and her pain and her rage, something that used our Ouija board like a doorway. And I think it followed us home.
The silence in our house was a heavy blanket, thick and suffocating, since the nursery stayed empty. Every single sound, the creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of the fridge, it all just echoed the one sound that was missing. It had been months, but Willow's eyes still held that raw, aching look, and I knew mine did too. We were both just shells, drifting through days that felt like an eternity. That's why when she pulled out the old wooden box, dusty and forgotten in the attic, my heart sank and fluttered all at once. She looked at me, her voice a whisper. Just one last try, Elias. Please. The Ouija board sat between us on the coffee table, a relic of a past attempt at a party trick, now loaded with desperate hope. I didn't believe in it, not really, but I believed in the look on her face, and I'd have done anything to ease her pain. So we sat there, fingers resting lightly on the planchette, the air thick with unspoken grief and a fragile, terrifying hope. At first, nothing. Just the silence, broken only by the rain tapping against the window. Then a shiver ran through Willow's hand, then mine. The planchette moved, slow and steady, to H, then E, then L, L-O. A simple, innocent start that felt like a punch to the gut. Willow gasped, a tiny sound of fragile wonder. Is it? She started, her voice breaking. The planchette moved again, faster this time. I, A, M, A, E, R, E. My breath caught. It was a cruel trick, a coincidence, right? But Willow's face was alight, a spark of life I hadn't seen in months. Our baby, she whispered, tears welling. The board spelled out Y, E-S. A wave of warmth, then cold, washed over me. It felt wrong, but her joy was a balm. We asked questions, timid at first, then with a growing eagerness. The board spelled out things only we would know, tiny details about our hopes for her, the little lullabies we'd sung while she was still a possibility. It was uncanny. It was terrifying. It was everything Willow needed. I found myself wanting to believe, needing to believe the impossible comfort it offered. But then the messages changed. Subtle at first, M-O-R-V-E-V-E. It seemed sweet, but something about the demand in the letters sent a chill down my spine. The connection felt stronger, almost demanding. The air grew heavier, always colder around the board. Willow, though, was oblivious, glowing with a renewed, almost manic energy. She spent hours talking to the board, convinced she was nurturing a connection with our daughter. I started seeing things, shadows playing tricks in my peripheral vision, a faint, sweet smell of baby powder when no one was around. I tried to talk to Willow about it, to suggest we stop, but she just looked at me with a frightened stare, claiming I was trying to take our baby away from her again. One evening, as Willow was deep in conversation with the board, the planchette moved with a frantic, aggressive energy. T-E-E-Y-D-O-N-W-N-E-M-E-E-R-E. Willow started crying, clutching the board protectively. Then the board's message turned ugly, aimed at me. Y-O-R-I-D-E. My blood ran cold. The grief that had united us began to tear us apart, fueled by the invisible entity that whispered poison through the cheap wood. Willow clung to the board, to its lies, pushing me away. My family, my wife, was slipping through my fingers, and I felt utterly helpless. That night, I woke to a cold breeze in the room, even with the windows shut tight. A low, distorted hum filled the air, and Willow was out of bed. I found her in the living room, kneeling by the board, muttering to herself. Her eyes were wide, vacant, staring past me. The planchette was moving without her hands, shifting back and forth, vibrating on its own. The board spelled out NOTCHEEABYNOWOME. A sickening realization hit me. This wasn't our child. This was something else, something old and hungry, twisting our sorrow into its own dark design. It had grown strong, thriving on our pain. I grabbed the board, intending to break it, to burn it, to do anything to banish the evil that had invaded our home and our lives. But as I pulled it, it felt stuck, heavy. Willow shrieked, a sound not quite her own. She lunged at me, her eyes wild, a force I didn't recognize propelling her. She was stronger than I had ever known her to be, fueled by the possessive entity that had latched onto her. She fought with a terrifying ferocity, clawing at me, trying to keep me from the board, a desperate puppet on unseen strings. Every scratch, every desperate plea from her lips was a fresh wound, but I knew I had to push through, for both our sakes. With a surge of desperation, I managed to yank the board free. It shattered against the wall, wood splintering, letters scattering across the floor. A piercing, inhuman shriek ripped through the house, echoing from the broken pieces. The cold dissipated instantly. Willow collapsed, trembling, her eyes slowly focusing on me, then on the broken board. Her face was pale, filled with dawning horror, but the vacant look was gone. We held each other, the echoes of the shriek fading. The silence returned, but this time it felt like peace, cold and empty, but finally our own. We were broken, but for the first time in months, we were truly alone. And somehow that was a comfort.